heard a voice inside my head telling me to kill myself. Everything about the voice, pitch, tone, intensity, volume, spoke of violence and aggression, like something from a horror movie. He was so persistent that I made superficial cuts on both my inner forearms with a shaving razor to make him shut up. Afterwards, he more quietly responded, "Brownie points for the effort." Around this time, I'd also seen a shadowy man standing in my kitchen in front of the stove. A ghost ship sailing through my living room. A terrifying scarecrow in a burlap mask and dark clothing, who was actually a pile of sheets and blankets on my bed, but still somehow oozed with ill intent. When the nightmares and visual delusions finally stopped, another auditory hallucination took over. Initially, the new male voice was very comforting. We had extensive conversations in my mind. There was an erotic or romantic tone to some of our conversations. We grew closer until a female voice popped up, yelling at me, telling me she was his girlfriend, and that I had no right to try to steal him away from her. She said the whole situation was my fault because he was drunk when we first started talking. Now they tease and insult me, calling me names,
Shame on you!
disrespecting my spiritual beliefs.
Representing the body and blood of your murdered savior.
I feel like I have invisible hands touching me throughout the day, attempting to arouse me against my will and verbally mocking me afterwards. Sometimes I feel fingernails drilling into my temples and trying to either pinch my mouth shut or poke into my mouth. Fingers clench around my wrists and ankles, squeezing painfully tight like metal handcuffs. The female voice who calls herself Lisa is the worst. She yells unintelligibly at times or just repeats everything I say aloud, or every thought I have, hoping to irritate me. They attempt to control my feelings, thoughts, and actions every single day. I realize both voices are delusions and that I haven't done anything wrong. Sometimes knowing that doesn't feel like enough though. They're still with me off and on from nearly the moment I wake up until I fall asleep, around 9 p.m. or earlier. Eric and Lisa get louder and rather agitated, speaking so fast I can barely keep up and cannot easily pay attention to anything else. The voices tell me repeatedly, just give up already. That I won't do. But I'm willing to learn to live under less pressure and to be gentler and more patient with myself. Eventually, the voices will disappear and my mind will be mine again. Till then, it's just white noise. My voice is the only one that really matters.
Because we use our brain all the time, it seems paradoxical to say that we don't understand it, but it's true. The brain is one of the least understood human organs. And when the brain starts functioning in a way that impairs our ability to think correctly, or to relate to others, or impedes our daily functioning, something we call mental illness, we understand it even less. Because mental illness is so misunderstood, a great many myths have developed around it. The purpose of this video is to explode some of those myths, tell you what you can do to maintain good mental health, and help you understand what you can do in the rare instance that someone with a mental illness becomes a threat to themselves or others. We think the best way for you to use this video is to show it to your entire firm or association in a group setting, and then take some time to discuss it for 30 minutes afterwards. Mental illness does not discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of age, gender, race, occupation, wealth, or any other factor. Larry Doan is the court coordinator for the Dallas County Mental Illness Court, where mental illness warrants are obtained for people who become a threat to themselves or others. He reports that people subject to mental illness warrants come from every background.
I've had judges come in to necessitate getting a warrant even on an associate judge. We've had attorneys' offices come in perhaps to either get a warrant on one of their associates or one of their clients. Maybe not their client, but somebody that wound up in their office and was really far out.
The statistics on mental illness are alarming. According to the National Alliance for Mental Illness, approximately 1 in 4 Americans, over 61 million, will experience a mental illness this year. 1 in 17 Americans, about 13.6 million, live with a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, major depression, or bipolar disorder. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., is more common than homicide, is the 3rd leading cause of death for persons aged 15 to 24 years, and the #1 cause of death for college students. More than 90% of those who die by suicide had one or more mental disorders. According to the National Comorbidity Survey, over 57% of Americans will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Among the major medical conditions in the United States, mental disorders contribute to the highest number of lost years of life due to premature mortality and disability. For lawyers, the statistics are even more alarming. The evidence is pretty strong that lawyers suffer from mental health disorders at a greater rate than the general population. Florida State University law professor Lawrence Krieger's research shows that practicing lawyers exhibit clinical anxiety, hostility, and depression at rates that range from 8 to 15 times that of the general population. Johns Hopkins University researchers interviewed 12,000 workers about depression. Lawyers ranked #1 on the list of occupations that were most depressed. Of the 28 occupations studied, lawyers were more than 3.6 times more likely to be depressed than average. A quality of life survey conducted by the North Carolina Bar Association in 1991 reported that almost 26% of that bar's members exhibited symptoms of clinical depression. Almost 12% of them said they contemplated suicide at least once each month. North Carolina's 2002-2003 follow-up survey changed the suicide question to allow a broader range of responses. There, 4.6% reported having thoughts of suicide at least once a month, but an additional 15.6% reported having such thoughts less often than once a month. A survey of 801 lawyers in the state of Washington found that 19% of the respondents suffered from depression. Daniel Lukasik reports in The Complete Lawyer that 25% of the nation's 1 million lawyers suffer from some form of depression. Benjamin Sells reports similar numbers in the Florida Bar News, noting that 1 in 4 lawyers suffer from elevated feelings of psychological distress, including feelings of inadequacy, inferiority, anxiety, social alienation, isolation, and depression. Surveys of Washington and Arizona lawyers show that most lawyers suffering from depression also had suicidal thoughts, and that lawyers have a much greater risk of both attempting and committing suicide. Suicide currently ranks as the 3rd leading cause of premature death in the legal profession. Male lawyers are twice as likely to commit suicide than men in the general population. Why is this? there is some evidence that mental health disorders are caused or exacerbated by law school. There is a higher rate of depression among law students than any other professional student body. In studies conducted by Dr. Andrew Benjamin in the 1980s and 1990s, depression among law students approximated that of the general population before law school, about 9 to 10%. However, it was 32% by the end of first year and an amazing 40% by third year, never returning to pre-law school levels. Despite the fact that mental illness is the most serious public health problem in the United States, the stigma attached to mental illness remains strong. Remember, a U.S. adult is more likely than not to suffer from a mental illness during their lifetime. Yet this stigma remains. Why? The stigma attached to mental illness has disastrous effects. It results in mentally ill people refusing to seek treatment and pushes mentally ill people into isolation, both of which can worsen their symptoms. Fortunately, a number of brave, recognizable high achievers have stepped forward to disclose their battles with mental illness. Perhaps most prominent among them is Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin graduated from West Point, third in his class, flew 66 combat missions during the Korean War, and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He's also the first PhD to become an astronaut. He held a doctorate in astronautics from MIT. As part of the first manned lunar spaceflight, he walked on the moon, managed to fix a broken circuit breaker with a felt-tip pen on the return trip, and then landed to unearthly fame. He ultimately experienced depression and successfully sought treatment. His courage led him to go public with his depression at a time when such problems were hardly ever publicly acknowledged, and to become chairman of the National Association of Mental Health. He's gone on to write several best-selling books, successfully land on the Titanic, making him the person who has gone the highest above and lowest below the Earth's surface, ride a Russian nuclear icebreaker to the North Pole, and obtain 3 U.S. patents for his schematics related to a space station, reusable rocket, and spaceflight module. Oddly, mental illness may be associated with success.
Well, we talked about earlier a study that was just done in Sweden of almost the whole population of Sweden that showed there is a link between creativity and mental illness, and they're looking at mental illness as a more positive thing rather than a negative thing necessarily, that it helps people to produce and to create things that they wouldn't ordinarily do, like obsessive compulsive behavior might be one thing.
Give an example of that, how that's beneficial.
Like I was telling you about my visit last week in Switzerland to the Albert Einstein house.
Right.
And that definitely seemed to be a behavior of his, was to just sit. We visited the museum that was originally his apartment, where he worked on the theory of relativity. Mm-hmm. And he sat at the window and he just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote for hours, ignoring his family, ignoring his children, ignoring his wife, and eventually had no relationship with them because he was so obsessed with his work. Mm-hmm. So,
and it allowed him to achieve a great thing.
Good for his work, good for society, not so good for his wife and children.
Many of our most prominent artists likely suffered from mental illness. Tolstoy, Plath, Hemingway, Dickens, Brando, Van Gogh, Beethoven. Their heightened sensitivity to the human condition made them great at their art, but those same traits may have given rise to mental health problems as well. And we see it in many artists of today. Jean-Claude Van Damme, Britney Spears, Winona Ryder, Tammy Wynette, Brooke Shields, J.K. Rowling, Emma Thompson, Vivian Leigh, Rosie O'Donnell, Marie Osmond, Margot Kidder, Ashley Judd, Roseanne Barr, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Billy Joel, Janet Jackson, Linda Hamilton, Carrie Fisher, John Nash, Patty Duke, Delta Burke, Adam Ant, Sheryl Crow, Pat Conroy, Judy Collins, Dick Clark, Jim Carrey, Drew Carey, and Owen Wilson have successfully battled mental illness. Unfortunately, some of the greatest artists of recent times, such as Kurt Cobain and Heath Ledger, have not been so successful in their battle. What is mental illness?
The behavior continues over a long period of time. And it's not something that someone can experience like a divorce or a death of a family member or friend. And that person may go through the normal mourning stages, but recover and get better. The person with mental illness may not get better so soon. They may continue over a long period of time with an inability to cope or to continue with their daily activities.
Some significant types of mental illness include anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, depression. Anxiety is anxiety that interferes with a person's ability to lead a normal life. The symptoms cluster around excessive, irrational fear and dread. Examples are generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and social phobia or social anxiety disorder. Heisman Trophy winner and former Houston Oilers Hall of Fame running back Earl Campbell, whose courageous style was to run over opponents rather than around them, suffered from panic disorder. He reported in his book, The Earl Campbell Story, that the condition caused me to shut myself up in my house, where I would sit in the dark, frustrated, crying, afraid to go out. At one point, I even considered suicide. Campbell sought treatment and was able to regain control of his life. Bipolar disorder is defined as manic depression. The symptoms are unusual shifts in mood, energy, activity levels, and the ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. The types are bipolar 1 disorder, bipolar 2 disorder, bipolar disorder not otherwise specified, and cyclothymia.
The winner is Patty Duke and the Miracle Worker.
Patty Duke became the youngest person to win an Oscar at the age of 16. But her bipolar disorder subjected her to extreme mood swings, periods of elation where she was incredibly productive, yet oblivious to consequences, and periods of severe depression, resulting in immobilizing sorrow, even suicide attempts. Finally properly diagnosed at the age of 35, she began a lithium regimen that balanced her and allowed her to continue her amazing career as an award-winning actress, president of the Screen Actors Guild, best-selling author, and tenacious advocate for mental health. In schizophrenia, the brain interprets reality abnormally. The symptoms can include hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thinking and behavior. The types are paranoid, disorganized, undifferentiated, and residual. Alongside Willie Davis, Lionel Aldridge anchored one of the greatest defensive football teams of all time, the Vince Lombardi-era Green Bay Packers during championship runs from 1965 through 1967. After retiring, the defensive end launched a promising career in radio and television broadcasting, but due to paranoid schizophrenia, he began hearing voices. Aldridge then began to think he was constantly being watched and people could see his innermost thoughts. He believed the television camera could see into his soul and that there was a conspiracy to destroy him. Within months, Aldridge became a vagrant, living in flop houses and on the streets, losing his career, his family, his money, and even his self-respect. After standing for hours in a roadside ditch in Utah, believing he was being crucified, a starving Aldridge crumpled beside a bridge where he pulled out his last link to his past, a Bible he took on NFL road trips, and read these words from the Apostle Paul: "Earnestly seek the higher gifts." After reading that passage, Aldridge wrote in Guideposts, "Didn't I know all along that there was one voice with me my whole life, a flowing, wordless voice that said, 'You are loved'? It was the voice of God, a voice for all of us to hear in our own way. I'd never stopped believing in God, but his voice had been drowned out by my illness. When I stopped long enough to listen, I knew that with God I had hope. I had love." That was what Paul was talking about. Heading back to Milwaukee, Aldridge was ultimately hospitalized with some difficulty and overcame his illness.
One of the first things they'll have to do in the second half.
Once a promising network announcer with a magnificent voice, Aldridge suffered from schizophrenia, lost his job and his family, wound up literally in the gutter, where his Super Bowl ring was stolen off his finger. Still, he remembered Lombardi's teachings.
Without a doubt, the most important thing was never give up. You know, never quitting. I mean, this has become a part of my life.
Aldridge didn't quit, fought schizophrenia with medication and dedication, and now tries to help the mentally ill by lecturing on mental health.
Aldridge became a vigorous advocate for the homeless and mentally ill until his death in 1998. Interestingly, one survey has showed that 10% of Americans admit having heard a voice when alone or seeing something no one else could see. And a 1999 Gallup poll reported that a whopping 23% of Americans had heard a voice or seen a vision in response to prayer. Yet hearing voices does not necessarily mean that a person has schizophrenia.
But when I would get worried is when the person is exhibiting what is often called command hallucinations, where the voice is telling them to do something. They not only hear God, but God is telling them to go out and shoot up the church.
If someone has mental illness, they're not necessarily a danger to themselves or others, are they?
No, and usually they're not. The people that exhibit the command hallucinations and that type of behavior are slightly more of a risk to do something dangerous than the general population, but only slightly. And people that do the things like we were talking about, the mass murders and do the really scary things, do not usually have mental illness. Though we've seen some lately that do. So that does happen, and they're more at risk of doing something violent if they are hearing these voices that tell them to go out and see something.
Depression is characterized by a mood state that goes well beyond temporarily feeling sad. Symptoms can include depressed mood, poor concentration, insomnia, fatigue, appetite disturbances, excessive guilt, and thoughts of suicide. The types are major depressive disorder, chronic depression, atypical depression, and manic depression, or bipolar. Former Pittsburgh Steeler and four-time Super Bowl winning quarterback Terry Bradshaw suffered from severe depression. He reported after his third divorce, literally crying for days.
That is not normal.
He recognized his problem, successfully sought treatment, and has gone on to pursue a successful career as a football commentator, producer, and actor.
Hallelujah.
Psychiatric research has explored the link between depression and doing well at certain occupations. According to psychologist Lauren Alloy of Temple University, much research suggests that when they are not depressed, people are highly vulnerable to illusions, including unrealistic optimism, overestimation of themselves, and an exaggerated sense of their capacity to control events. The same research indicates that depressed people's perceptions and judgments are often less biased.
If I wanted a lawyer, that's the kind of lawyer I would want, because they would be taking care of me and worrying about all of the things and seeing, being skeptical about the information they were getting in.
Right.
And there was one study that I read that said of a review of all the professions, they were optimistic and the lawyers were pessimistic.
Right.
And so that was good for their job, like you were saying, that was good. But the bad side of it, or the dark side of it, is that kind of pessimism can lead to depression. If you're always delving in, skepticism and negativity, then you can move over into the depressive side.
Unfortunately, major depression can move a person into a virtually frozen state where it becomes impossible to act. Abraham Lincoln's depression made him a great president. But there were times in his youth when depression pushed him over the edge and he became immobilized and suicidal. However, had Lincoln not suffered from depression, he may not have been able to succeed. An optimistic Lincoln may not have been able to anticipate the succession and resolve of the South and make plans to counter it. A depressed Lincoln, of course, worried about such things and was able to plan. But a Lincoln that was clinically depressed would have felt the situation was hopeless and there was nothing he could do. And it is that tipping point that people who tend toward depression have to avoid.
If they're being competent in getting their work done and getting along with people in the environment, there's probably not a problem.
Right.
But when they start being late, not showing up, leaving at lunch and not coming back, not getting along with people in the environment, being angry, shoving people, yelling at people, when you see these kind of signs that they're getting out of control, they're not completing their work anymore.
So how does a person maintain good mental health?
Exercise, eating correctly, sleeping. I was just reading about sleeping is more important than I think we recognize, getting adequate sleep.
Oh, I believe that.
Mm-hmm, me too.
I mean,
So
go long
usually
enough.
sleep deprived.
Go long enough without sleep, and it's really tough to function in general.
So all those healthy things, not smoking.
Right.
Not drinking too much. Now that we haven't touched on that, but substance abuse is another co-occurring disorder that you often see with mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So being aware of that, alcohol, drugs, can exacerbate it. Particularly the educational component is important if they know that in their family they have a history of major depression. There are many groups where education is the focus, where they can go and learn about the illness so they can be more aware of what it is that they need to be looking for. And they can be more aware if they already have had an episode of major depression and are treated successfully, what would indicate to them that they're about to relapse, because you can intervene there, change your medication, and prevent that relapse.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you go down that path, when you do relapse and have to go back into the hospital, then it's harder.
Right.
Like you say, talking to someone, being with someone, getting support is essential, because social support is one of the components usually of a treatment for mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So support is very important. Isolation is not good.
The stresses of the job can also exacerbate a pre-existing depressive illness or bipolar disorder. So I think there are additional challenges that may be present.
This is particularly true in the legal field. A study by Career Bliss in 2012 found that associate attorney topped the list as the most unhappy job in America, with paralegal close behind at number 7.
I think that sort of environmental incident can trigger a mental illness, especially if the person is susceptible to it or may have some genetic predisposition.
Those who have endured extraordinarily stressful environments can be more prone to mental illness. For example, suicide among active duty military presently exceeds combat deaths, and suicide among veterans takes place at a rate of 1 every 65 minutes. For every veteran killed by enemy combatants, over 25 veterans take their own lives. Thus, it is true that sometimes mentally ill people can become a danger to themselves or others. It is a rare situation that a mentally ill person is a danger to others. In fact, mentally ill people are more likely to be victims than victimizers.
People with mental illness are usually the victim, not the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So they're about 11 times more likely to be victimized than the general population.
However, the consequences of ignoring a potential danger to others can be extreme. A number of mass killings have been linked to mental illness. But far more common among the mentally ill is suicide. While it is possible that a mentally ill person can commit violence against others or themselves without forewarning, typically there are signs that give rise to this possibility.
What they can look for is when the person has, over time, not just a bad day, because all of us have bad days where we may act somewhat unusual or crazy, but over a time period, someone who's doing things that are very unusual, like withdrawing when they've been a very gregarious person. You're looking for a behavior that's the opposite of what you would usually expect from the person.
A personality change.
Mm-hmm. A personality change, changes in sleeping, changes in eating. Perhaps they're eating too much, sleeping too much, or the opposite.
And if someone couples that behavior with a threat,
mm-hmm.
that's when it's time to get serious.
A threat against themselves or others. or a plan. Oftentimes someone who's feeling suicidal may share a plan with someone, with a close friend or a family member. And a lot of times the family members don't want to believe it. You know, they think, oh, well, they're just, you know, talking, and
Blowing
they're
off
not
steam.
really going to do that. But every threat should really be taken seriously.
And some of the threats can be relatively subtle, just, you know, I want to die, things like that. And, you know, people say that all the time, and it doesn't mean anything most times, but coupled with that change in behavior is when someone should be thinking, we probably need to seek some kind of intervention here.
And pursuing it to see if they really have a well thought out plan. Because the more that they've planned this and have, you know, some details about what they're planning to do, that can be more of a signal that they're really seriously considering doing. And if they've purchased a gun recently and they're talking about ending their life, or if they purchased poison or stockpiling a lot of prescription drugs that they could use, that type of thing. And family members are in a position to notice those kind of things oftentimes.
The most likely people to notice these changes are friends, coworkers, and family.
Friends and family members and even coworkers or teachers are the ones that usually notice the behaviors first. The person who's experiencing it may not have the insight or may even be in denial and not recognize that they're doing something unusual or that their behavior is changing.
When such behaviors are noticed, early intervention is critical in avoiding a violent act.
Early intervention is very important at that point because a lot of mental illness can be short-circuited if you get the person into treatment, which usually involves some psychoeducation. So education about the illness, medication if called for, treatment on an individual and a family level, social supports.
Obviously, the best option is to convince a mentally ill person to seek treatment. But there are times when a mentally ill person cannot properly process that request, and the intervention of the state is necessary. All states have procedures by which a mentally ill person can be detained and evaluated.
The other opportunity, if it's not an immediate emergency, and if there's time to act, you can go to your local county judge, to the county courthouse, and they will assist you in filling out very short paperwork in which an adult can file what's called an application for mental health services. And then the judge will make a determination if there's enough there in the judge's view that the person has mental illness. The form will ask you to identify some recent overt acts that show that the person either is a danger to self or others or is deteriorating to a point where he or she can't take care of basic needs. And then the judge can issue what's called a magistrate's warrant, which would allow a mental health deputy or other deputy to go out and transport the individual to the nearest mental health facility.
To better understand these procedures, we spoke to Larry Doan, the court coordinator for the Mental Illness Court in Dallas County, Texas.
The mental illness court basically is set up to hear the cases for involuntary court commitments for folks that are basically a threat to themselves, threat to others. Some of them are basically unable to make a rational, informed decision for treatment. A mental illness warrant basically is for the purpose of having someone taken in for emergency evaluation. All right. We issue mental illness warrants here. At the court, we have a social worker that will help the applicants with all the paperwork, the forms, and so forth. What we're looking for is an applicant can be anybody over 18 years of age, a credible person, and so forth, with firsthand observable behavior. Criteria we're looking for, which will funnel down into all aspects of the court proceedings is that the applicant has reason to believe that that proposed patient is exhibiting a threat to others, threat to themselves. Once the warrant is issued, in Dallas County, the applicant will take that warrant down to the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's going to give them a number to call. And once they want that person picked up, or the person is there at that location, then they're going to call the sheriff. And the sheriff has to have someone there at the location to open the door for them and identify them. They won't force entry. Once the warrant is issued, it's good for 14 days. Okay? Can an applicant withdraw the warrant, you might say? Basically what would happen is the applicant just would not call to have the warrant executed. Sheriffs are going to send the warrant back to us unexecuted. The sheriff's going to let them know they have an order. Patient says, I'm not going to go. Proposed patient says, I'm not going to go with you. Family may say, no, forget it. Well, once the officers are there, they're going to execute the warrant. They say, we have an order. What gets touchy is when the officers handcuff the person, because by policy they cannot transport otherwise. What happens to the person once the sheriffs have picked the person up is at that point they're taken either in Dallas County, they're taken to Parkland Psychiatric Emergency Room, or they're taken to Green Oaks Psychiatric Hospital. Both of those are contracted under what we call value options. They're the initial checkpoint for evaluations, okay? Once they've arrived at the facility, the magistrate's warrant is good for 48 hours. 48 hours. Used to be 24. The legislature changed it. The doctor needs to examine that person within 12 hours of the arrival. Before the end of the 48 hours, the physician either has to file an order of protective custody if they feel, in fact, the criteria is there, risk of harm to self or others based on their evaluation, okay? If not, then they need to release the person immediately.
Now, just and to be clear, the person who's the subject of the mental illness warrant, they're not taken to jail by the sheriff.
Cannot be taken to jail according to the Mental Health Code, cannot be mixed with any jail population, that type of thing.
And because they've
And if we did not have a catchment hospital close enough, even if they were taken in to a jail type setting, they have to be totally separated and so forth.
And they do not, as a consequence of this mental illness warrant, they don't have a criminal record as a result of that either.
No, it has nothing to do with criminal.
And this warrant, it's a matter of public record, but it's kind of a strange public record, right? Talk about that.
Yeah. The Mental Health Code states that it's a public record of a private nature. But those two little words are very, very strong, private nature, which means total confidentiality. The only person that could access that record would be the patient or the patient's attorney of record, and that only if they make application to obtain court records, which is reviewed by the judge, and if he signs the order, then they'll make a certified copy for that patient.
And you were even telling me that if I came down and applied for a mental illness warrant yesterday and then came back and said, I want to see that again, you'd say?
No. I say, I can't tell you even here yesterday. That's done to respect the law and protect the patient. Everything done through the mental illness court is in the best protection and interest of that proposed patient.
In the event there is not time to obtain a mental illness warrant, all states give the police discretion to detain and evaluate a person who appears to be mentally ill and a danger to themselves or others.
Law enforcement can be called as well, because under Texas law and the law of most states, an individual peace officer has the ability to come out on the scene and, based either on what he or she witnesses firsthand or based even on hearsay, information provided by others, can make a determination on the spot that the individual may well be a person with mental illness and may need to be brought in for an evaluation. And the officer has the authority then to take that person, not to jail, but to the nearest mental health treatment facility for an evaluation. And so I wouldn't hesitate in making that sort of call.
Given the prevalence of mental illness among attorneys, untreated mental illness poses significant ethical and disciplinary risks. The ethical rules address mental illness in several respects. Under North Carolina Rule of Professional Conduct 1.1, a lawyer must provide competent representation. Although this rule typically goes to a lawyer's skill and experience, Comment 8 to Rule 1.1 implicates some of the symptoms of certain mental illnesses. It notes that repeated failure to perform legal services competently is a violation of this rule. A pattern of incompetent behavior demonstrates that a lawyer cannot or will not acquire the knowledge and skills necessary for minimally competent practice. For example, a lawyer who repeatedly provides legal services that are inadequate or who repeatedly provides legal services that are unnecessary is not fulfilling his or her duty to be competent. This pattern of behavior does not have to be the result of a dishonest or sinister motive, nor does it have to result in damages to a client, giving rise to a civil claim for malpractice in order to cast doubt on the lawyer's ability to fulfill his professional responsibilities. Under North Carolina Rule of Professional Conduct 8.3a, a lawyer who knows that another lawyer has committed a violation of the rules of professional conduct that raises a substantial question as to that lawyer's honesty, trustworthy, or fitness as a lawyer in other respects shall inform the North Carolina State Bar or the court having jurisdiction over the matter. Some states allow the attorney possessing knowledge of the ethical violation of another the alternative of reporting the offending attorney to a peer assistance program if the violation is the result of impairment due to chemical dependency or mental illness. North Carolina does not have this exception. However, the North Carolina Rules of Professional Conduct do not define fitness, and Comment 4 to Rule 8.3 seems to muddy the waters on the duty to report a lawyer suffering from mental illness rather than provide clarity. It says, if a lawyer were obligated to report every violation of these rules, the failure to report any violation would itself be a professional offense. Such a requirement existed in many jurisdictions but proved to be unenforceable. This rule limits the reporting obligation to those offenses that a self-regulating profession must vigorously endeavor to prevent. A measure of judgment is, therefore, required in complying with the provisions of this rule. The term substantial refers to the seriousness of the possible offense and not the quantum of evidence which the lawyer is aware. A report should be made to the North Carolina State Bar unless some other agency or court is more appropriate in the circumstances. Rule of Professional Conduct 1.6c and Comment 6 to Rule 8.3 exempts a lawyer from reporting ethics violations learned during the course of an approved lawyer's assistance program. It reads, information about a lawyer's or judge's misconduct or fitness may be received by a lawyer in the course of that lawyer's participation in an approved lawyer's or judge's assistance program. In that circumstances, providing for an exception to the reporting requirements of paragraphs A and B of this rule encourages lawyers and judges to seek treatment through such a program. Conversely, without such an exception, lawyers and judges may hesitate to seek assistance from these programs, which may then result in additional harm to their professional careers and additional injury to the welfare of clients and the public. For this reason, Rule 1.6c includes in the definition of confidential information any information regarding a lawyer or judge seeking assistance that is received by a lawyer acting as an agent of a lawyer's or judge's assistance program approved by the North Carolina State Bar or North Carolina Supreme Court. North Carolina Rule of Professional Conduct 5.1c can make a lawyer responsible for the conduct of another lawyer. It reads, a lawyer should be responsible for another lawyer's violation of the rules of professional conduct if 1. The lawyer orders or with the knowledge of the specific conduct ratifies the conduct involved, or 2. The lawyer is a partner or has a comparable managerial authority in the law firm in which the other lawyer practices, or has direct supervisory authority over the other lawyer, and knows of this conduct at a time when its consequences can be avoided or mitigated, but fails to take reasonable remedial action to avoid the consequences. Given these requirements, all firms should take steps to remediate the effects of mental illness. As all good attorneys know, the impact of any problem can be reduced through prevention and preparation. Firms should have regular meetings where attorneys can talk about the stresses of practicing law. In effect, a de facto support group. It doesn't have to be a formal thing. It can simply be lawyers getting together and talking. Next, firms should encourage physical fitness, meditation, lifestyle balance, and social interaction. And furthermore, firms should note behavior changes in their attorneys or traumatic life events and seek early intervention. Law firms also should engage in mental illness preparation. First, check some things. The long-term disability policies for mental illness clauses, health policies for mental illness treatment, and know that even with the Affordable Care Act, some plans offer broader coverage than others. Next, establish an environment that encourages self-reporting, one that is confidential and supportive, not stigmatizing. Also, establish channels to report behavior changes and traumatic life events. And finally, establish a procedure for leave of absence. Make sure that there's continued client service and offer job security. Finally, know your responsibilities under the ethics rules. Know mental illness symptoms and know a process for seeking mental illness warrants or similar vehicles if necessary. Experts offer advice on how to maintain good mental health. First off, maintain physical fitness. Secondly, eat well. Third, maintain social contacts. Maintain interests outside of work. Avoid withdrawal. Avoid self-medication. Talk about your problems. Know your family history as it relates to mental illness. Recognize the symptoms of mental illness and seek help in its early stages. And use professional or support group assistance with traumatic events or mental illness triggers. As addressed in the outset of this video, mental illness is our nation's #1 public health problem. A U.S. adult is more likely than not to experience mental illness in his or her lifetime. While most mental illness is benign, if left untreated, certain mental illnesses can result in unspeakable tragedies. Understanding mental illness is the best way to address this public health crisis.